You're welcome to the Iowa Bounce panel of our Futures Forum. And before I introduce the topic tonight, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge some of our colleagues. Andy Messersmith, where he is over here, thank you for helping us with technology tonight. It's so important. Kim McDonough has done a marvelous job with our Futures Forums, and Kim is seated right there. Thank you, Kim, for all your hard work. And also members of our advisory council, not only Dave Kearns, but Terry Rich and Beth Pellet-Levine and Annette Hacker, Scott Stanzel, Dick Doak. Dick is here. Where are you, Dick? Dick Doak and so many others have helped bring these world-class journalists to tonight's forum and to the three forums that we have tomorrow. And I have exciting news about our Futures Forums. We now have official sponsors thanks to the generosity of William and Linda Tubbs, publisher of the North Scott Press in Eldridge. Bill and Linda, would you please stand up? The William F. and Linda Z. Tubbs Endowment will help bring top media professionals to campus, such as we have tonight, to inform and enlighten students, faculty, and the public about vital issues in the media. Well, it's caucus time again. 4 years ago at our annual Chamberlain Lecture, Sandy Johnson, she was the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Associated Press at the time, caused a stir in this very room by predicting that Hillary Rodham Clinton might not be the Democratic nominee for president. Senator Clinton, now Secretary of State Clinton, had a long campaign ahead of her. She also did not tolerate fools very well, and a presidential election is a media circus replete with clowns, pundits, jugglers, press secretaries, high-wire acts, bloggers, and fortune-tellers, pollsters. Candidates throw their hats in the ring, literally a three-ring circus, and Iowa is the first ring, New Hampshire the second, and the rest of the country the third. Now, most of you are thinking that Iowa played a big role in the election of Barack Obama. And on one level, we did. After all, President Obama won the precinct caucuses with 38% to Clinton's 29%, a solid victory. But Hillary Clinton was the real hero of Iowa in 2008. Her role has been largely overlooked. If we examine that, we not only will see how important Iowa is in the political process, but also how influential media are too. No candidate comes to Iowa for the votes. They come here for the coverage. In 2008, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, Mike Henry, wrote a memo to her that underestimated Iowa's worth. Are you listening, Mitt Romney? What is the cost relative to the benefit of dedicating significant funding and other resources to Iowa, he wrote. Mike Henry made these predictions. Iowa will cost $15 million and require 75 days of Senator Clinton's time. The caucus process in Iowa, he said, used to be based on grassroots and volunteer organizing. Now it's just a circus requiring millions in political advertisements. Results would be inconclusive, he said, because first, second, and third place in Iowa are only typically decided by a point or two. Now, Senator Clinton's campaign manager, who would be replaced, by the way, was wrong about the point spread and just about everything else. Hillary Clinton would go on to campaign vigorously in Iowa, stating this on caucus night in 2008, quote, "We have seen an unprecedented turnout in Iowa, and that is good news, because today we're sending a clear message that we're going to have change, that change will be a Democratic president in the White House in 2009. After loud applause, she added, "I am so proud to have run with such exceptional candidates. I congratulate Senator Obama and Senator Edwards." John Edwards. He came in second place that night, garnering 30% of the vote. What would have been the result had Hillary Clinton taken her campaign manager's advice and skipped the Iowa caucus? In May 2008, political blogger Andrew Malcolm of the LA Times wrote that John Edwards would have won the Iowa caucus. At the time, Malcolm and the rest of the country did not realize that Edwards was involved in an illicit affair. This year, Edwards was indicted for spending close to $1 million to keep his mistress and their baby in hiding during his presidential campaign. Had Edwards defeated Obama in 2008, the presidential election might have turned out differently. The Edwards campaign could have gone on to another primaries. And I'm not the only one who said this. In 2008, they were saying it in the summer. And then they would undergo close scrutiny. This scandal could have put Republicans John McCain and Sarah Palin in the White House, conceivably. This is the power of the media in shaping political coverage, and students in the Greenlee School understand this. They know about the power of the iPad these days in covering politics, not only at caucus time, but throughout the year. They learn to research before they interview and to follow up after they post. Most of all, they learn how to cover politics ethically and comprehensively to preserve our liberties and maintain our rights, as Iowa's state motto reminds us, and as our panelists will remind us tonight, too. They are Greenlee School alumna Kathy Obradovich of the Des Moines Register, Jeff Zeleny of the New York Times, John McCormick of Bloomberg, Diane Bystrom, the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics, and Chuck Todd of NBC News will join us electronically. Our moderator tonight is one of our distinguished alumni, Bill Monroe, retired executive director of the Iowa Newspaper Association and current transparency director for Governor Terry Branstad. Mr. Monroe is a seasoned journalist, and he will keep the discussion lively. Each panelist will open with a brief statement, and later Mr. Monroe will take questions from the audience. Join me in welcoming Bill Monroe and our media panelists tonight.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening. Welcome. It's great to see so many people here for the forum, and thanks again to Bill and Linda. It's great to see you guys step up. It's wonderful. We're going to be here for a little over an hour, and you're all going to have a chance to ask questions yourself, so be thinking about any questions you might have for the panel. Before we start, I'm going to give you a little more information about each one. Jeff Zeleny is the national political correspondent for the New York Times. This is his fourth presidential campaign. Can you believe it? I mean, look at this guy. His fourth presidential campaign. He travels frequently to Iowa, New Hampshire, and other places around the country. He was the lead writer for the newspaper's midterm election coverage in 2010 when he covered the Republican sweep of the House of Representatives. And he came to the Times in 2006 from the Chicago Trib, where he worked for 5 years as the national political correspondent in Washington. He began his career right here in Iowa in the Des Moines Register, where he covered the Iowa caucuses in 2000, the state legislature, and criminal and civil courts. Next to Jeff is Kathy Obradovich. She's a journalism graduate from Iowa State, and she's been covering Iowa government and politics for more than 2 decades, including the last 4 presidential caucus campaigns and the Iowa State House. She joined the Register as a political editor in 2003, just a few months before the 2004 caucuses. In June of 2009, she took over from David Yepsen as the Register's political columnist. Next to Kathy, we have John McCormick. He's a Chicago-based Bloomberg News reporter. He covers the Midwest and national politics and government. This is his 4th presidential campaign after getting the bug in 1999 and 2000 while at the Des Moines Register. Prior to joining Bloomberg in 2009, he worked in the Chicago Tribune, where he covered local national politics and a guy by the name of Obama. Besides working in Illinois and Iowa, he worked at newspapers in Minnesota, which is his native state. Next to John is Dr. Diane Bystrom. She's the director of ISU's Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics. She has personal and professional experience in covering, working in, and studying political campaigns. She's a frequent commentator on politics and women's issues for state and national media. In addition to directing the center, she teaches courses on leadership, women in politics, and political campaigns for women's studies, political science, and speech communications. And joining us by Skype with the Iowa State cap, we have Chuck Todd. He's the chief White House correspondent for NBC News. and the host of the Daily Rundown on MSNBC. He became NBC News political director in March of 2007. He also serves as NBC News' on-the-air political analyst for NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, Today, Meet the Press, and MSNBC. Before joining NBC News, he was the editor-in-chief of national journals The Hotline, and he also serves as contributing editor to The Atlantic Monthly and frequently contributes op-ed essays for various publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. He currently resides in Arlington, Virginia. Please help me welcome this distinguished panel. We're going to jump right into the questions, and I'm going to address each question to a panelist from my left to right. However, none of them are shy, and I've told them anytime they want to jump in and comment, that's great. We're interested as a group tonight in talking about the caucuses and their importance in the presidential process. Just how important, Jeff, is winning Iowa? Or is it not about winning, but just to beat expectations? What's your view on that?
I think it's a myth. I think it's a mix of both. But you can ask a man named Barack Obama how important winning Iowa is. He would still be a senator, in my view, if he had not won the Iowa caucuses. We can discuss and relitigate what happened here in 2007, but Iowa was critically important that year. And it's important if you win and if you go on to win the nomination. I think one thing that people in Iowa don't necessarily appreciate is what a great opportunity and really a great opportunity, I guess is the best word to say, to see these candidates and question the candidates. So I think Iowa is very, very important. Now, every 4 years, there's a question of the calendar, if Iowa should be first, if New Hampshire should be first. John and I were discussing earlier, we love coming back to Iowa. We got our start here. So I hope the Iowa caucuses stay forever, but I'm not sure that that'll happen. And I think part of it is if the winner of Iowa becomes the nominee and then the president, that protects the Iowa caucuses. But if not, if Hillary Clinton had become the president, the Iowa caucuses probably would not be here. So I think Iowa is very important, but it sort of depends what comes after that. And since the Republican campaign is the only sort of active campaign this side, I think it depends what type of Republicans are participating. If it's Republicans across the board, I think that will make a difference. If it's more social conservatives, which it has been in the past, that is going to make a difference. But I think Iowa is very important, and it gives a head start to New Hampshire, which probably will be the week after Iowa, but it could still be before Iowa, actually, because they still have not set their primary date.
Kathy?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank the Greenlee School for having us tonight. And actually, I feel very at home in this room because this is where my wedding reception was many years ago. And thanks, by the way, for saying that I had been in the business for 20 years and then not saying, and doesn't she look like that?
Oops.
No, I'm just
I'll
kidding.
pay for that.
I would just add to what I agree with what Jeff said, but I would just add that every 4 years there's kind of a great paradox with the Iowa caucuses, because you hear a lot of times how the Iowa caucuses are not very predictive of who's going to be the next president, and they're not. I mean, just look at the history of the winners of the Iowa caucuses. There's only about three presidents three presidents who came through the Iowa caucuses, going back to Jimmy Carter. So they're not really very predictive about who's going to be the president, and yet they're simultaneously sort of lambasted as being too important. Well, okay. So can they both be not predictive and also too important? I think they can be, actually. They can be both. They can be very important without actually choosing a president every time. It's a value judgment about whether it's too important or not. The other thing I would add is that even though we know that in the future there's going to be some president elected who is kind of hostile to the idea of Iowa and New Hampshire going first, Iowa and New Hampshire do not care about that. Iowa and New Hampshire have insisted on going first when there's been great opposition to both from around the country, and there continues to be great opposition around the country. But so for Iowa and New Hampshire to be sort of ousted as first in the nation, not only do you have to have a hostile administration who's head of one of the major political parties, but also you have to have some sort of consensus on what to replace it with. And Iowa and New Hampshire have benefited from the status quo, not because everybody thinks it's a great place to start the presidential race every 4 years, but because nobody can agree on what to replace it with. And so you always end up falling back on Iowa and New Hampshire. And as long as they're having the contest, the candidates are going to come because they're afraid not to. So,
As John, as you comment, I'd be interested also in knowing what you think about what effect, if any, the seamlessly endless number of debates, one from each cable channel, is having on the importance of the caucuses.
Yeah, I just got here from the last debate. I landed I was in Las Vegas this morning, where it was also very nice, but about 80 degrees. Mm-hmm. So it's good to be here. Thank you for having me. But yeah, the debates, there's been 8 of them so far, and they have sort of, taken up a lot of reporting time. We haven't been able to go out and do as much enterprise reporting as maybe we'd like to, because there's always another debate coming around the corner. So that's been a little bit of an issue. In terms of just following up on what Jeff and Kathy said, I mean, candidates don't come here for votes. I think that's true. I mean, Iowa only has 5 electoral votes, and pretty soon it's going to have 4.
no. We had 7, and now we're going to have 6.
7. Okay, thank you. 7 and 6. It's not a big general election state, obviously, but it is a place where candidates really are tested. And I covered Barack Obama's campaign from start to finish, and I can say, I mean, he was not a very good candidate when he first arrived here in early 2007, but he did event after event after event, and I was at probably 90% of them, and he got better over time. By the time the Jefferson-Jackson dinner rolled around about this time, almost exactly 4 years ago, he was a pretty good candidate, and he gave a pretty good speech that really sort of electrified that room. So the media does play a role here, but I think just the grinding it out process that Iowa is really built upon. These candidates have to come here. They have to spend a lot of time. They don't do a lot of advertising, although I think that's going to start picking up here fairly soon. But it does test them, and the media is part of that, but the electorate is also a big part of that.
Diane, do you have any comments?
Well, I'm the person that's not from the media on the panel. I actually started out as a reporter and then went into academia, and now I actually study political campaigns primarily from a communication standpoint, but also media coverage. And I've talked to all of these people in my role as director of the Carrie Chapman Cat Center. I moved here in 1996 in the summer, so this will be my 4th caucus as well. And I would say, from my perspective in studying, campaigns from an academic perspective, that each cycle has been a little bit different. And so one thing that happens when I talk to reporters, they're always trying to kind of read into this cycle. And from my perspective, they've all been different. And one of the things that I hope we can talk a little bit more about tonight is the fact Dr. Bejea, mentioned in his opening, comments about what makes Iowa unique, and the fact, that Clinton almost, skipped it because of the expense in coming here. When you look at the 2008 cycle, you really do see the 2 people who spent the most on the campaign in terms of political advertising were Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney, who did not win the Iowa caucuses. And I would argue the people that year that took a risk and did something different, which was Huckabee and Barack Obama being a very technology-based campaign, grassroots, social media, data mining. We can get into that, but that's a new, a thing that they use. The same thing, when you go on your Facebook page and you see on those ads down the side, that's data mining, and so he used a lot of that. Huckabee used very non-traditional means in going through the homeschool network and also evangelical churches and kind of leafleting on cars. And so you still have that sense in Iowa that it is a state that I think is important in the process. As has been said, it's where candidates, I think, can really test drive their message. And so while it's not predictive, I think it gives candidates the ability to test drive their message, see if it's successful. And as I say to a lot of reporters, we may not pick the candidate, but we certainly narrow the field.
Chuck?
Well, I would just say a few things just to add to what's there. Is that one is you'll I think between we have the press bias here about Iowa in that there are a lot of people that got their start covering politics in Iowa, so that sort of helps in an odd way keep Iowa where it is. I have my own bias toward Iowa. I have a whole bunch of family buried in Iowa, as I always say. I have more family buried in Iowa than living there anymore. I know that's a natural thing that happens to Iowa these days. But then the other is the fact there are so many campaign operatives in national politics who got their start in Iowa. So in a weird way, it's it's self-fulfilling. So I can't imagine that that you'd be able to kill this off. And then the third thing that helps it is that Iowa's a swing state in the general. If it stops, so you can always make that added pitch to a campaign that's, if you're not sure and you think you might be the nominee, well, you don't want to offend the state parties there because you're going to be back there actually worrying about a general election campaign. And if it ever stopped being a swing state or being perceived as a swing state, then you could see someday the other party, whichever way, if some reason Iowa just became a 60-40 state in one direction or another, saying, why are we starting there? That's a waste of resources in the long term. But I'll add one thing, listening in the introduction. Mike Henry was right. There was no way Hillary Clinton could win Iowa at the point that he wrote that memo. He knew it. He knew there was no way of winning, even winning, no matter what, whatever the bar of expectation was, it just wasn't going to be. You do wonder what would have happened if she had followed the advice and skipped it. We probably would have given her a hard time in the press. We probably would have said, see, this proves she's weak anyway. But then again, they may have put together an actual decent campaign for the other states. So in hindsight, I think he was proven to be right. I think the reasons in that memo that he put in there were right. Now, she felt she had no choice because I think one was the swing state issue. And the second was how does the national front runner skip a state? And I think Mitt Romney, I think it's a trap. And I think he's going to end up playing in Iowa and he's going to lose it. It's high risk. If he wins it, it ends the race. It could be a one state, but he could get sucked in and give life to the person that beats him, either really beats him or the perceived beating, i.e. how Gary Hart beat Walter Mondale in Iowa by losing by 30 points.
They say that money is the mother's milk of politics. You can't do anything without money. That may be changing with free media, with all of the debates and all the exposure candidates are getting. It wasn't that long ago when they might do 2 or 3 debates. Now they're, like I say, one every week. Is it possible to put a value on that free media coverage? And does it give people that don't have a lot of money an opportunity to compete where they might not have had otherwise?
We'll find out. If Rick Santorum happens to win the Iowa caucuses, or if Newt Gingrich happens to win the Iowa caucuses, the answer would be a yes. But I highly doubt that. I think money does matter because money gets organization. And the whole point of the Iowa caucuses are basically pulling people out on this night of January 3rd, in the winter. So I think money is still very important. So I would be very surprised if someone without it, it's probably more important than ever, actually, because with super PACs, you are all about to see more ads than you've ever seen before, I believe, and it will just be hard for someone to break through. I'd like to add one thing to what Chuck said about the Hillary Clinton thing. I think she could have won Iowa, actually, if she would have campaigned differently here. And one thing at the very end, I didn't realize it at the time this was happening, but a colleague of mine who was covering the Clinton campaign was always sending me emails. I was on the Obama campaign. Hey, I'm back in Des Moines. Do you want to have a drink? You want to have dinner? I'm like, I'm not in Des Moines. We're in Dubuque. We're in Sioux City. We're in Burlington. And I couldn't figure out at the time through the whole month of December why she was back in Des Moines every night. But her staff brought her back. because she wanted to stay at the Embassy Suites and be in the same hotel every night. So she missed a lot of events in the morning and the evening because of flying around in the winter and things. So I think there were a lot of things that her campaign did that did not serve her well, and we saw that throughout the primaries as they went along long beyond Iowa. So I think she had a lot of disadvantages, but just some small things like that, which I didn't even realize what it meant at the time.
Right.
But I think something like that was significant.
Kathy, getting back to the money issue, Herman Cain recently, as he rose meteorically, said this is an instance where message beat money because he didn't have that much money. What do you think? What's your opinion?
Well, I think that money matters in the Iowa caucuses, but it's not the only thing. There's smart money and there's stupid money, and there's a lot of stupid money that gets spent in Iowa. And I would contend that the Iowa straw poll is an example of a lot of stupid money that gets spent. And if you question that, ask Michelle Bachmann, who spent a boatload of money on the Iowa straw poll, which you guys should all know what the Iowa straw poll is because it happens right here on this very campus. And it's a big Republican Party fundraiser. And Michelle Bachmann, for example, spent a lot of money per vote to get people here to the Iowa straw poll, and then immediately had another candidate enter the race and completely obliterate any sort of benefit she got from the win. So, I mean, I think that because she was able to spend that she was a good fundraiser, she was able to spend that kind of money, and she was able to win the straw poll, and maybe in another year that might have made a difference, but this time it didn't. Look at Steve Forbes. There's an example of a guy who came into Iowa. He had a really big money advantage. He spent a lot of it on advertising that was reaching a lot of people who weren't going to caucus. And so, the direct TV ads, for example, they're really nice to have in a caucus, but they are reaching a whole lot of people for a lot of money who are not going to caucus. You're really a lot better off with very targeted direct mail, and that's also where social media comes in now as being a really big benefit in this campaign. So I do think, and money spent on organization is smart money generally. Your organization, having a great organization, is not going to save a mediocre candidate, because if money could save it, if organization could save a mediocre candidate, Tim Pawlenty should still be in the race right now. He had probably the best organization going into the straw poll, but he just didn't have the popularity to perform. So I think that you do have to. And Herman Cain, getting back to your actual question, he has the poll numbers, but he does not have an organization in Iowa. Now, on January 3rd, right after the holidays, it could be blizzarding, et cetera. You're going to need more than poll numbers to actually get people out the door, away from the bowl game, whatever bowl game is playing, and to go down to their local school or fire station and sit there for 2 hours. So the organization part of it does matter, and Herman Cain is hoping that he is going to be able to actually raise some money from his popularity of message and his debate performance in order to actually help fund some sort of organization and get out the vote effort in Iowa.
John, I'd like to pick up on something Kathy said about the Iowa straw poll. A lot of people don't know how that works. It seems to be that in the past few years, it's taken a lot of the maybe spotlight away from the caucuses. It's maybe it's a glorified fundraiser in some people's minds. Do you think it should reserve as much attention as it gets? Because everybody was here.
Yeah, everybody was here. We were all here. It does get a lot of attention. I think it is sort of two bites at the apple. The caucuses are supposed to be the one big bite, and I think the straw poll does attempt to sort of get two bites at the apple. And it also sort of speaks to an issue that I personally think Iowa has to sort of watch carefully, and that's sort of the over-commercialization of this thing. I mean, it's historically, I don't want to sound like an old guy, but I mean, even in the 4 cycles that three of us up here have covered and observed, the thing has really grown a lot. I mean, used to be able to go to an event and there'd be, a few reporters and maybe a couple cameras. Now there's, huge network crews, there's bloggers, there's Republican bloggers, there's Democratic bloggers, there's other bloggers. I mean, it's just this huge, media thing that it's become. And so I think Iowa has to make sure that it maintains, the true retail nature of this, that it is supposed to be a grinded out. It's not just a media event. It's not just a, big fundraising thing where you can throw a lot of money at the straw poll, and you do have to have some message and you have to have some organization, but money does go a long way at the straw poll. And whether it is a good thing for the party, I guess the proof will be in the pudding a little bit here when we see maybe the dynamics of this race would be a little bit different right now if Pawlenty was still in it. Maybe was he forced out prematurely because he did some strategically maybe questionable things, and he did put a lot of money into the straw poll, obviously, but it does not appear likely that Bachmann will be the party's nominee at this point, and she sure won that straw poll.
And nor does it appear that the second place winner will be. Right. Chuck, what was NBC's interest in the straw poll?
Excuse for me to go to Iowa, and honestly, we used it as a way to kickstart our coverage, and we have 8, we call them embeds, but I used it at the time. I knew there'd be all the candidates going around, so I used it as a way to train some of our younger reporters on their new beats, their new equipment. It was mostly, frankly, a way to just test our ability on the campaign trail. So I used it that way, and in that way, it was great. And I hope there's some sort of summer event. Plus, I wanted them all to understand what it was like to eat anything fried on a stick. Always an important part of showing up in August in Iowa. But let me pick up on your point about money.
Sure.
We have, first of all, I think Huckabee. We've already had the example of debates making a candidate. Mike Huckabee was a television performer. Frankly, his whole political career has been performance art, and I say this as I'm not trying to denigrate him, but he was being a preacher before getting into politics made him a natural politician and a natural performer and a very good in these events. And the debates made Mike Huckabee. I mean, I think if anybody, there's always so much focus when we talk about 07 and 08 on Obama v. Clinton, one of the greatest primary campaigns in our lifetime. But we forget, Mike Huckabee was a creation of the debates. He did so well at them. He was the charming guy. We're seeing a little bit of that, a poor version of it, a poor man's version of it, I think, with Kane. Kane is the guy that is wearing well at the debates, and I think that's what these debates have done. So I would say it's, money, you have to meet a certain threshold. But I do think we've entered a stage where money isn't the be-all and you don't have to have the most money. You need to have a certain amount of money and a certain amount of organization. But there are so many other opportunities to get an in-kind contribution or in-kind resources, whether it is debates, whether it is the fact that media's flattened a little bit. And there are a lot of ways to get your message out in non-traditional ways that are cheaper than television. And then we have another problem that I think that this is a real challenge for political campaigns going forward, is the 30-second TV ad is no longer effective at 1,000 points. And I don't want to get in, I apologize for throwing in lingo here, but now you have to double the amount of, in order to get the impressions you want to get, because so many people TiVo, or there are so many different channels you have to advertise on. So it's so much more expensive now to use television, and it may be so much less effective. So we're at a weird stage on money. It's still huge, and you can't ever say it's not important, but it's plateauing in its importance, I would argue.
Diane, let's change the subject and talk about what seems to be the almost manic changing of the schedule and the vying of states. And it seems to be the overall effect of all of the jockeying for position is that it's condensing the process. Good or bad? Do you have any feel or any research for Any idea of if this serves the voters better than not doing it this way?
I think most academics would argue that it doesn't serve us very well. I mean, it used to be that you didn't have to enter the campaign so early as you do now.
Right.
It is very compressed. It does place more importance on money. Even though we're in retail politics in Iowa, you still have to spend a lot of money. So I think by and large, but I don't think we can get out of this cycle. It's gone compressed every cycle, even more than the cycle before it. We had the 2008 caucuses here on January 3rd. It looks like we're going to have the same date this year. Very compressed schedule to where, again, speaking of political advertising, is that the one benefit that we will see in Iowa is that candidates don't want to take out negative ads over Christmas. So we're going to see a lot of warm and fuzzy ads again this year like we did in 2007. But it really compresses the process. I think the other thing that happens is that when you have these caucuses and primaries close together, one of the benefits for the candidate is conventional wisdom is you want to have at least 7 days, I think, between those events, because then the person who wins gets somewhat of a bounce over it. And now if you compress it to where, New Hampshire's talking about, if it's less than 7 days, more like 4 days, it really doesn't benefit the candidates who have spent all the time and money in the states to get the bounce.
Chuck, if that happens and it's fewer than 7 days between events, what's that do to the importance of the caucuses?
Oh, well, we already had this. We saw this 4 years ago. And we've seen it where I think we only had 5 days between Iowa and New Hampshire, which, of course, remember, Obama won big. Hillary Clinton, was second or third, depending on if you wanted to count via delegates or count via the straw vote. And so that meant Obama swept it, right? Oh, wait. In 5 days, she made up the ground that we all saw. So I don't know whether there's such an intensity of the coverage now and hour by hour, the changing of things that I don't think we can sit here and say definitively, especially on the Republican side, where it's had such an uneven history of how important it is. And look, if Mitt Romney's the nominee, then you'll have 2 Republican nominees in a row who essentially either fully skipped Iowa or basically half skipped it. Maybe Romney will prove me wrong in the next 75 days, but he seems to be just trying to have one foot in Iowa. That's something that would concern me if I were an Iowa Republican wanting to protect the caucuses.
John and Kathy, what do you think?
Yeah, Chuck makes the point that there's this, such expansive coverage now that, everything is hour by hour and there's so much coverage on the internet and on television. I think maybe, a 5-day bounce between Iowa and New Hampshire is maybe the equivalent of a 10-day bounce, of 15 or 20 years ago. So, I think, whoever comes, Jeff and I both studied under, David Yepsen when we were at the Register in 99, 2000. Yepsen used to say there's 3 tickets punched out of Iowa, and 3 people would get to go on from here. There's a win, place, and show. And, I think that probably is sort of still correct. You can see a scenario where, Romney finishes in that top 3, and maybe even better if he does come in here and play aggressively in December, which my gut tells me he probably will do, but we'll find out soon enough. But then on to New Hampshire, and this thing could either be over really quickly, or it could be a replay like 2008, and it'll go on and on and on and on. Jeff and I were both riding around in that Obama campaign plane all of the spring of and into the thing really wasn't settled until June, and you can see scenarios this time where that could play out as well.
I thought 4 years ago that the experience that the Democrats had where the nomination fight did, in fact, drag on and on and on and on, would actually make some states like Florida think twice about trying to crowd to the front. That some of the states that waited ended up being a lot more influential than anybody expected. And instead, 4 years later, we're right back to crowding to the front. I would agree with Diane. I don't think it is a good thing, not just for the vote, not just for the candidates or the bounce that they get, but also for voters. And I do think that it hurts voters in later states. There's been studies. There was one recently out of Brown University that looked at the momentum generated by the early contests and how difficult it is for anybody else to break out of that. And the figure that study used was like the people in the early states votes count 5 times more than people who are later in the calendar. Well, of course, Florida wants to move to the front if that's the way those are seen. So I think that this is going to keep compressing to the point where it becomes so ridiculous. We don't know yet if New Hampshire is going to stay in the actual election year, if they're going to end up going into December, for example. Eventually get to the point where the voters in New Hampshire aren't going to put up with it, let alone Iowa, South Carolina, et cetera. So I think that there is a natural limit to how far it can go. The RNC tried to put a limit on the compression by setting the rules that they did, and look what happened. Everybody just, Florida at least is ignoring the rules. They have good reason to believe there's not going to be much of a penalty for it. And so that's the other thing is the national parties are going to have to decide if they're really going to get serious about sort of draconian penalties to try and enforce these calendars.
Just very quickly, if New Hampshire goes to December, I think it will kill Iowa and New Hampshire for the future.
Why Iowa and New Hampshire?
I think it will just throw it will. I think Iowa will get thrown into this and be like, okay, the monopoly's over.
Right.
And I think you will see the
Game's up, right?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think, and to Matt Strawn's credit, I think the Iowa Republicans knew this, and that's what he did. He did what he did to try to save Iowa in the future. I think you crack that calendar. You crack December, and it's hard to defend. I'm a huge defender of it because I believe you should start small. You got to start somewhere. Start in a smaller state, forcing conversations. But it's hard to defend if they go into December.
Jeff, I'm going to start this one with you, and anyone else can jump in, and you can apply your own media label to this. But what do readers of the New York Times think about the caucuses? Do they understand what they are? Do they understand how they work? Do they think it's a primary? I mean, do they understand the difference?
I think most probably do not understand the difference, at least at this point. But the people who are reading the stories at this point, the people who are following the race at this point, we have readers more and more eyeballs are on our stories because of technology than ever before. So I think the people who are following it understand it. A lot of people think it's unfair. I get a lot of email from readers saying, why all these stories from Iowa? Why does Iowa have all this significance? So I think they are certainly wondering around, especially around the time of the straw poll. It just seemed, why all this coverage to something that really, is meaningless. But I think it depends what kind of stories we're talking about. A lot of the questions are asked here by voters. I'm always surprised by what kinds of questions voters ask candidates. I was in Western Iowa this afternoon with Mitt Romney, and he had a very staged event. He isn't alone in this, obviously. That's what campaigns are about. But he had, 12 people around the table, I think. I was there with Kathy. And I think he was expecting economic-type questions. It was in the basement of a bank. And some woman asked him about Israel. And she asked him about foreign policy, and she wanted to ask him about social issues, but she ran out of time. So there's only, I think when you're talking about issues in Iowa, our readers across the country are actually finding out information about these candidates by what Iowa voters are asking them. So the process of the Iowa caucuses, I think, is something that probably annoys people from elsewhere. But the actual questions that people are asking, I think people find interesting. But one thing in terms of the compression, just to really fast, it is really compressed at the beginning, but this really has the potential to go really long, as John was saying, because the Republicans have changed their rules now, and this is going to be a delegate to contest if it's still going to be competitive. So the California primary now is in June. 4 years ago, it was in February. Super Tuesday now is no longer in existence. It's going to be, mini Tuesday. Only 6 states or something have their primaries on Super Tuesday. So a lot of the delegates are at the far end of the calendar. So we could really be having a 6-month contest here if this remains competitive.
John and Chuck, talk to us a little bit about perception of the caucuses.
Yeah, I think the caucuses are not very well understood outside of Iowa. I mean, I think it'd be interesting to do a national poll on this. We should probably include this in our next national poll that we do. But I suspect if you ask people, is there a difference between a caucus and a primary? I'm not sure many people would say that there is, and if they did, they certainly couldn't articulate what it is. So I think this process is a little odd, and like Chuck said, if things fall into December, I sort of agree with him. I mean, the franchise could be lost here, and because it's already, we all at this table, we love Iowa, we like to come here, but the state obviously is not at all representative of the country. I mean, I think we all know that. It's, demographics are off the chart different from the nation as a whole. And so it's real easy for a state like Michigan or Pennsylvania or Florida or any of these other states that would love to get in on the action to make the case against Iowa. So that's, I talked a little bit earlier about it. Iowa needs to sort of be careful about how hard it plays its hand here, because I do think this thing is very easily at risk, and most of the people outside of Iowa do not understand it, and they think it's all about these candidates showing up and talking to farmers, which it is a little bit, but it's obviously a little bit more sophisticated than that as well.
Well, I can just tell you very quickly that my colleagues in New York they hate the Iowa caucuses. It bugs them. I fight them a little bit and say, well, you know what? New York gets everything else. Go ahead and, I think, isn't it okay if something that's not on the East Coast has a monopoly on something when it comes to our political process or the media process? But the caucuses, at least the Republican caucuses, are a lot easier to explain than the Democratic caucuses and the Democratic rules on how the caucuses work, with the whole, you have to have threshold and all this stuff. None of that, at least on the Republican side. So in many ways, I think this time won't be as hard to explain. It was hard to explain 4 years ago about the whole, wait a minute. So Joe Biden was polling at 4 or 5%. Bill Richardson was polling at 6. Why did he end up with 0? That wasn't the easiest thing to explain to viewers.
Kathy, before we go to questions from the audience, what do Iowans think? I mean, a very small percentage of Iowans end up attending the caucuses.
Yeah, I would say that there may not be a lot of New York Times readers who understand the caucuses, but I think there's also a lot of Des Moines Register readers who probably don't really understand the caucuses. And I was just talking to a group in Cedar Rapids, and I said, well, they get this reputation for being this sort of mysterious, secretive kind of Da Vinci Code rite of initiation, and that's just the Democrats. So, so I think we need to do some more education among Iowans about, first of all, use it or lose it. I mean, this is really the best opportunity that Iowans have to influence influence what the President of the United States does. Secondly, I would say that the process itself, first of all, is sort of dictated by the rules of the National Party, and Iowa's effort to remain first means that the rules are going to be complicated because you have to get around all of these other federal rules that are really sort of designed to prevent things like what Iowa does. So, Iowa doesn't really even select delegates at its caucuses because New Hampshire won't allow that to happen. So you end up with a contest that is a lot more meaningful as a way for candidates to campaign, to organize. Interesting how Chuck was saying he used the straw poll to train his staff. Well, that's what the candidates are doing too. They're using the straw poll to sort of do a dry run with their organizations. So there's a lot of benefit to Iowa that goes beyond the demographics and the issues. But I will say about the demographics and the issues, Iowa 4 years ago launched the first African-American president. okay? So it's not like Iowans are only electing people who look and think like them, first of all. Secondly, if you go to these town hall meetings, like Jeff just said, or you do polling. We do a lot of polling at the Des Moines Register, not as much as we used to, unfortunately, but we still do a lot. And more, when you look at the issues that Iowans find most important, they're very, very similar to what the most important issues that everybody else in the country. So yeah, Iowa doesn't look like everybody else, but when it comes down to the issues that they find most important, there really not a whole lot of difference.
Thank you. We're going to go to questions from the audience. When I came in here tonight, first guy I ran into was Dean Borg. And I watch Dean Borg every week on Iowa Press, and I've watched him every week forever on Iowa Press. And I said, what the heck am I doing up here, and where are you down? And you should be up here. I'm going to ask Dean to ask the first question.
But I'd like to pick up on some body language that I noticed here when I invited when Chuck made the comment about Hillary Clinton, no way was she going to win Iowa. You were shaking your head vigorously in the way that you are right now. I'd like to know why you reacted like that. Was it because of political coverage, shaping the race? Was it because of a sign on a barn over around Tama that I drove by repeatedly that said, Hillary, go home? Was it that she didn't tailor her campaign to Iowa, or was Iowa hostile to gender or something else? I'm just asking, why did you say she didn't have a prayer?
Well, all of the above, actually. I don't think she ran the best campaign here, but you have to remember, and I've said this many times, Iowa's one of only 4 states in the nation that have never sent a woman to Congress. We have a below-average representation of women in our state legislature. We've never elected a woman governor. We don't have a very good record of electing women in the state of Iowa, and so I think it's tough for women to run here. And I think it was tough for her to run here. I actually agree. Why I was nodding my head with Chuck is that when I read the introduction last night that Michael was going to give tonight, I thought that, again, her campaign manager was right. And she might have had a better strategy to use somewhat of a McCain or this year a Romney strategy where she had her foot in Iowa and she paid attention to Iowa, but she ran more of a national campaign. I think in the end, I do believe her advisor was right. It was going to be a tough row for her here. And I think that she would have been better off maybe having a different strategy. Having said that, once she committed to Iowa, then I think she ran the wrong kind of campaign here. She was really, they've talked about tonight, she was in Des Moines a lot. She really didn't use technology as much as Obama. But when you talk to the Obama people, and some of them were my former students that were actually running the Obama campaign, they really felt like they were taking a risk. They didn't know if what they were going to do was going to work here, and it did. And so they were taking a risk. Hillary Clinton ran a very traditional campaign, but again, I think she, in retrospect, if she would have run a different campaign where she wouldn't have spent, she spent, let's say Romney spent $9 million on advertising. I think she spent around $8 million. Obama spent a lot on political advertising too, but he ran more of a non-traditional campaign. So I just think it was a tough campaign here for a woman candidate. And, I think she made some headway here, but I think she could have been, perhaps would have had the nomination with a different strategy that didn't put so much money into Iowa.
In terms of spending money, if I could just add one small thing, I'll never forget this. My a colleague at the time, Mr. Adam Nagurney, who was the chief political writer, a good friend of all of ours up here, he and I were at the Clinton headquarters right before, maybe 3 weeks before the caucuses. They were explaining how they were going to win. They opened up this huge garage on the east side of Des Moines with hundreds of snow shovels in there. So we are going to hand out snow shovels. I thought, everyone in Iowa has a snow shovel. That's the most ridiculous waste of money I've ever seen. There were hundreds and hundreds of snow shovels. And I thought, they really have no idea what they're doing here in terms of organizing. And it was by and large people from out of state who had not run Iowa campaigns. Not entirely. There were a couple Iowa people early on, but that was just one tiny example of, I thought, like these people, if they're relying on these green plastics, the snow shovels, if it was really snowing, they wouldn't work. So like the bad kind of shovels. But it was, I thought, something is going on here.
It's reminiscent of the Howard Dean orange caps, which, were another example of a candidate who campaign who sort of just didn't get it. I mean, people showed up with these orange caps at people's homes, and they were frightened. They were these, people from out of state coming in, with these orange caps, and it just didn't work. So, the tone here obviously is tricky, and it's hard for candidates to get the right tone.
And not to pile on Hillary Clinton, but she also made some mistakes in dealing with voters directly. She had a town hall meeting where famously or infamously, she had questions planted from the audience. I mean, the questions from the audience were actually scripted. And, these are scripted events, but Iowans expect to be able to ask real questions. So I do think that, Hillary Clinton, had she won the Iowa caucuses, it would have been historic for a woman. But, Michelle Bachmann won the straw poll. She won over a very, very conservative element of Iowa voters, very traditional family people, people who stay home and homeschool their children, for example. She hasn't gone all the way, and I don't think she will in Iowa, but that was an example of something where a woman had this year broke a barrier. No woman had won the Iowa straw poll before either. And it wasn't because she was a woman, it was because she was the right candidate with the right message at the right time. Whether she hasn't really, that the time is not right for her right now. She hasn't been able to sustain that for a lot of reasons. But I just don't, I guess I'm not as willing to buy the glass ceiling as an excuse for Hillary Clinton in Iowa.
Folks, it'll be, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chuck.
That's right. I don't disagree, but as long as the only two states are Iowa and Mississippi on this sending a woman to Congress or winning one of a major, either governor or Senate, you can't help but wonder if it's not an issue.
Thank you. Folks, you won't have many opportunities to be sitting in a room with these kinds of people. You can ask them anything you want about how they cover campaigns, about things that have happened along the campaign trail that they haven't written about that might be interesting. Anything you want. Who's got the first one? The young lady here. Please stand and go, there's a microphone we're going to hand to you so we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Carol McGarvey. I'm from Des Moines. I'm a freelance writer. I'm happy to see John and Jeff here. I'm a former colleague of theirs at the Register. My question is this. This is 2011, and I can't believe we're having this discussion nationally, but as Mormonism as a cult, if Romney is the Republican candidate, how big of an issue will that be for him?
I think if he makes it through the Republican primary, it will not be as big of an issue in the general election. But the question is the Republican primary, and I don't know the answer to that. I think we'll, be watching very carefully what happens in South Carolina, which is sort of famous for, a place for a negative, sort of underhanded attacks and things that John McCain experienced in 2000. And et cetera. But I think in the general election, I would be surprised if Mormonism was, or his faith was an issue. But before then, I don't know. I think it's a big test for that, and we'll find out.
Okay, there's another question, right? Yeah, in the turquoise, there we are.
I was just wondering how you guys decided what political campaigns to emphasize more in your news coverage.
Well, having been a columnist as well as air traffic controller for the last two campaigns, I'd say that's one of the most difficult decisions that you make is what campaigns to cover, especially when everyone is there. We tried to, in the Register, really tried to give all candidates an opportunity. And by all candidates, I mean all candidates who were at least the candidates that people had actually heard of. Okay, we didn't spend a lot of time, and at the Des Moines Register, we haven't spent a lot of time covering somebody like, let's say, Fred Karger. How many of you have heard of Fred Karger? So Jesse's heard of him. He's a Republican presidential candidate from California who's running as the only openly gay Republican in the race. Okay, so he's not getting a lot of news coverage. Buddy Roemer not getting a lot of news coverage. Maybe he's the former governor of Louisiana. People have heard of him, but he's not really campaigning in Iowa. So we're not giving him much attention. John Huntsman, even though he's in the debates, we're writing about him in the debates, but he's not campaigning in Iowa. And so we're with limited resources at the Register, we have to concentrate our coverage at least in some way, and we usually do it by picking the candidates who are at least active in the state and actually have some sort of national standing as well.
Chuck, let me twist that question a bit. What do you say to people who say the media picks the candidates by determining who to cover and who not to cover?
Then I'd explain why in the last NBC Wall Street Journal poll, Herman Cain was the guy who led. So I think it is certainly the media is responsive to. I mean, I tell you this is the way I look at it. I feel like last 4 years ago, and this is how we changed our coverage and how we're covering the campaigns this year. 4 years ago, we undercovered Ron Paul. We missed it. And when I say we missed it, we missed the beginnings of the Tea Party movement. If we had spent more time, I certainly went to a few Ron Paul events when I went on the road more as I know he keeps getting a lot of people to show up to these events. What is it? And he certainly wasn't, he didn't win enough delegates to make you think, okay, he had a shot at this, but he has a following. And his following, I think, was the roots of the Tea Party movement. And we missed. It would have been a story we would have be able to tell better back in 2009 when the Tea Party popped, had we spent more time with Paul supporters. So one of the things we changed this year is we're emphasizing zone coverage more. So I have 8 embeds. I had eight embeds last time, and granted we have fewer candidates to cover since there's one primary, not two. But I've got 2 people in Iowa that I can dispatch to any events. I've got one person always on Romney and one person always on Perry. But then I've got, sometimes I've got one person on Kane for a while. And then sometimes we have one person on Paul for a while. More so that we can get a better sense of who's showing up to these events. Do they have an organization? I think what Kathy just said, I think that's the fairest test. I've been arguing that Newt Gingrich doesn't deserve any coverage until he starts putting together a real campaign and starts showing up at events. And he wasn't doing that for a while. At least now he's acting like a candidate and scheduling events in places where they have where they're actually going to have voters in January. But I want us to be careful and not cover vanity campaigns either.
Okay, we have time for one more question, right here. Stand up. Well, we got a microphone coming.
Hi, my name is Jessie O'Poyne. I'm a journalism student here, and I just want to pick up on something that was said earlier about the fact that with the frequency of the debates, I guess enterprise reporting has kind of been left to not be executed as much as you'd like. At what point does that become detrimental to the public education, and what can change in order to fix that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to suggest that we're not doing enterprise reporting at all. I'm just saying these debates, especially when they're one a week, and maybe it's just because I just came from one, they just do take up a lot of bandwidth. They take up a lot of media attention. They take up a lot of reporting time. I probably would have been in Iowa earlier this week doing some other reporting if I hadn't been out there covering the debate. And, of course, these debates are always a little bit silly. We all fly out to these places, even though we're watching them in a filing center, just like you're watching them in your living rooms at home. I did have a very nice dinner in Las Vegas last night, but, the whole thing is a little bit crazy. I'm excited that there's going to be a break in debates now until, well, at least November 9th, but it's a couple weeks where there aren't any debates. I do think voters learn a lot about candidates in the debates. I mean, we learned some things about all of them earlier this week, and so I don't mean to be totally dismissive of them, but I think this year there's been too many of them. That's the kind of journalism that most of us really like doing the best. It's you pick up the newspaper or the website and the reader says, "Oh, I didn't know that at all." It's something that's it could be investigative in nature. Maybe it's looking at Mitt Romney's job record in Massachusetts, or his experience at Bain Capital, or looking at Rick Perry's history with the death penalty in Texas. Those are the kind of stories that sort of beyond just the campaign trail coverage.
I would argue that a lot of news organizations are doing a lot of those stories, and it's one of the reasons we have big staffs, and we do long investigative pieces on all the candidates and big issue pieces. So I think even more than the reporter's time, and John's absolutely right that it takes our time, it takes the candidates' time. So I can't remember a time, at least in the last 4 cycles, where there have been fewer actual campaign events because the candidates themselves are preparing for the debate, flying to the debates. The debates are very important. They've shaped perceptions in incredible ways. But I think there's still you can find out more about candidates now than you ever could. I think in any recent cycle.
Hey, the RNC should have taken control of this process.
No question.
They should have, and I say this as somebody who's obviously on my job. I've got to, my job's to go get debates too, and I got to get Telemundo debate, a CNBC debate, That said, boy, do I wish the RNC would have just said 1 debate a month, starting in July until New Hampshire. Then it's a free for all. Then after that, fine, everybody can do what they want to do. It would have brought some sanity to this process, but the RNC is the 2 major parties are both. They just can't control things the way they used to.
Thank you. We could go on all night, but they're going to kick us out of here pretty soon. So I want to thank the panel for your insight, for taking time out of your crazy schedules to be here. I hope you stay around. I hope you had the opportunity to stay around and enjoy the campus. It's beautiful. There's a football game Saturday. It's up to you. Basketball season's coming. And thank you all for being here. It's been a great pleasure. And good night.